This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This episode of Season 1 is brought to you by Astropad and HabitMinder. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. You know, we're going to pick up where we left off with John August last week. This is a really good episode because I really like where I think this is going to go. I mean, we're going to talk to John not only a little bit more about screenwriting, but we're going to start diving into apps, typefaces, and all that kind of good stuff. It's going to be really interesting, I think.
All right. So I want to talk about apps.
Let's go for it.
And Highland and all of that. So first of all, how did you get started making apps, and sort of how did you start your company, quote unquote, apps? Where did this desire to make software, I guess, come from?
So it all goes back to my website. So I have a website called johnaugust.com where originally I was just answering questions about screenwriting. And so that went on for many, many years. And often in answering questions, I would need to include a little bit of a screenplay segment. So just a couple lines of dialogue. And it was awkward to format it. So I ended up sort of coming up with like a little CSS for sort of what that would look like. But I wanted something that was more like Markdown because I was writing my posts in Markdown, obviously. I wanted something to sort of be able to do Markdown for screenwriting. And so I ended up emailing John Gruber. He was nice enough to email me back. And I described kind of what kinds of tools screenwriting needed in order to do this. And he's like, yeah, I can sort of see what Markdown would be like for that, but he has no time or interest in doing that. But he sort of encouraged me to figure out what that would be. So we ended up coming up with a thing called Scrippets, which is just a really simple plain text way of marking out like how screenplay stuff could look on the web. And basically within Markdown, I would start brackets and say Scrippet, and then end brackets for Scrippet. And within that term, within that little section, it would be processed in a special way. And Nima Yousefi, who is a very talented coder who was reading my blog, said like, oh, I think I know how to build that plugin. So he built a plugin for Scrippets, and that became sort of the way I would show bits of screenplay on my blog. And other folks started using it too. It was just a WordPress plugin. I kind of wanted to do more than just write these little snippets on websites. So I talked to Nima, like, is there a way we could sort of build this out into a bigger thing? And I wasn't the only person who had this idea. Stu Matskowitz started working on a thing called Screenplay Markdown, SPMD. We basically were coming at the same idea from different directions. And so ultimately those ideas kind of merged together, and we decided to call it Fountain. Fountain is the street that crosses Hollywood. It's like a famous fast east-west street across Hollywood. So Fountain became the name for this plain text markup language for screenplays. And it looks a tremendous amount like Markdown. Almost all the same rules apply. The crucial difference is that if I have a line that's uppercase and followed by a line by any other line, that uppercase line is considered a character name, and the line below it is dialogue. That's the fundamental difference between normal Markdown and Fountain. So we had this idea, and we both started working on like, well, what kind of editors could we make that would let people write in this Fountain markup language? Simultaneously, I had a frustration where I would be getting these PDFs of screenplays that I would need to edit, and there was no good way to go from a PDF down to an editable file. So again, I turned to Nima Yousefi and I said, I bet you have some magical hammer that could smash this PDF apart and bring it down to Fountain. And he's like, I think I could probably do that. So he did his wizardry, and he's able to take a screenplay and convert it back down to Fountain, which meant we could edit it, which was a game changer. So originally, we were editing it down to Fountain, and then I would bring it into Final Draft. But ultimately, this app we built called Highland, I started writing just in the raw Fountain and loving it. So that's ultimately what became the Highland app.
Okay. So this is kind of beautiful because we interviewed John Gruber a few episodes ago, and we asked about Markdown. So it's kind of perfect that we're now following up with one of the many flavors of Markdown, maybe one of the different ways that Markdown has created these different languages for different formats. I think it's a perfect follow-up to that. So can you describe what Highland is and what it does and how it differs from Final Draft?
I'll start two different ways. So there are going to be some people listening to this who are already totally used to Markdown, and I don't have to sell them on the virtues of Markdown, which is that it's so great to be able to just write in plain text in any editor and not worry about the formatting. The formatting is going to be taken care of by a different system. Traditionally, though, for screenwriting, people were using Final Draft. And in Final Draft, you have to tag every element of the screenplay to say, this is a character name, this is a parenthetical, this is dialogue, this is transition. And you do that by a certain number of tabs or by going in after the fact and line by line telling the application what this element is. And it's incredibly frustrating for anybody who's worked, in the modern web or has worked with something like Markdown. The system should be smart enough to figure out what it is that it's doing. So with Highland, the original version of it just could understand the fountain markup and go from that. You'd write in fountain, you'd click a button, and it would show you a PDF of the formatted version. And yes, there's algorithms behind the scenes that are figuring out, okay, if this dialogue is at the bottom of a page, how do I break this so that the character name repeats? There's complicated stuff happening, but it's still relatively straightforward. I wanted to go beyond that, though, and really look at sort of, now that this is just plain text, what are some interesting things I could do? What are tools I really wish I always had as a screenwriter? So we built in things like the navigator bar to sort of show all your scenes in a nice way. The bin, which I described, which is holding on to those bits of text. Built in sort of simple word count, sprints and goals, or even different templates. So if, obviously I could use this to write in for a screenplay, but if I'm doing that, it feels like this basically is a Markdown editor. So what are some other templates I could do for other documents you want to write? So like a school report or just a blog post. What are different things I could make this thing look like the same way that you would generally apply CSS to the HTML that you got out of a Markdown?
And you mentioned sprint mode as one of the feature highlights of the app, and I guess you actually use it yourself.
Every day, yeah.
Yeah, can you describe that, sort of how it works?
Absolutely. So when I talked about earlier, sort of how I like to get my work done, I work in 1 hour sprints, and so often on Twitter you'll see I'm starting I'll post 15 minutes before the hour, starting a write sprint at the top of the hour, 60 minutes, one task, no stopping, who's in. And other writers will join in and say yep, I'll raise their hand. I'll join you for that. It's that idea of just for 60 minutes, I'm going to do nothing else. And in Highland, there's a timer at up in the header bar, and you can set how long you want to sprint for and start. And it gives you a nice little graphic showing where you're at in this thing. And it's counting your words from when you started the sprint to when you ended the sprint. So you can see okay, in this sprint, I was able to write 500 words. That's great. Maybe later in the afternoon, I'll do another sprint and try to get a little bit more written. So it's that sense of, helps you find focus, but also some accountability in terms of this is the thing I did. So during this time, while that timer is running, I'm only going to be in Highland. I'm not going to be switching over to check my mail or do anything else.
Yeah, I like how it allows you to kind of chunk your work so that that there's a goal line that's within sight, right?
Yes.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you about the PDFs, because Highland can handle both importing PDFs and exporting to PDFs. And that strikes me as kind of a complex part of the app in a lot of ways, because I guess on the import side, is it OCRing and then figuring out the syntax from there? Is that how that works, or what's going on?
So Highland doesn't do any OCR. So the PDFs that's importing are generally PDFs made by a computer, so exported by another app. So there's text underneath there. It has to understand what the hell that text is. And what Nima, our coder, has had to do is really figure out, okay, which application probably made this PDF, because that's going to tell me how to anticipate how things are laid out on the page. Because two pages could look identical, but based on which app created it, there could be a very different flow for what's actually in that file and sort of how stuff's laid out. So part of it is where stuff is positioned on the page. And so if he finds an uppercase word that is in the middle of a page, that's almost definitely a character name. If he finds a line that starts with int or ext, very strong probability that is a scene header. Something that's over on the right-hand margin that ends in the word TO with a colon, it's probably a transition, like a cut to or a transition to. So he's looking for that stuff and then just applying logic to figure out, okay, this is the most likely way to interpret what is happening on this page. It gets more complicated because sometimes dialogue breaks at the bottom of a page, and so he has to put all that together. But he's a wizard and he figured out how to do it.
And I suppose the same kind of thing happens on the way out. I mean, you've got you're formatting it in a particular way, but you also have to kind of I assume, deal with how you're going to do the formatting when you have line or page breaks and that kind of thing, exporting as well, right?
Absolutely. So in the original Highland, they were very separate modes. And so what we showed you in the editing mode was just the raw text. Everything was on the left-hand margin. And then when you switched to preview, we built a PDF, and they were really completely separate engines. With Highland 2, we brought the engines closer together so that we can anticipate what page you're on, even in the editing view, because we're doing the math behind the scenes to figure out where stuff is. And so we're showing you the indentations in real time. It's moving stuff around based on what it knows about what you've just written. So there's more happening, but our computers can handle it, so they can figure out all that stuff. Nima will often throw War and Peace at Highland to make sure that it's fast enough to handle War and Peace in real time, and it is. So there's a YouTube video I put up that shows Microsoft Word and a few other apps trying to open Word and Peace just as a text file, and Highland, it's a few seconds, and Word chugs along for a few minutes before it can open it up. So Nima's constantly sort of optimizing to try to figure out how can we make this be responsive even while it's doing really complicated work behind the scenes.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Astropad Studio. Astropad Studio turns your iPad into a completely customizable graphics tablet. With Astropad, you can combine the power of the Apple Pencil with your favorite Mac apps right on your iPad. The makers behind Astropad understand that no two artists work alike. That's why they've packed Astropad with opportunities to customize every aspect of your workflow, with features like programmable gestures, custom pressure curves, and unlimited per-app shortcuts. They literally designed Astropad from the ground up for professional artists. Astropad also guarantees low latency performance over Wi-Fi or a USB cable, so you can set up your workspace on the go. It's a high-performance tool for the most demanding creative work, and today, Astropad is used by major animation studios and product design firms across the globe. So, if you're ready to take your creative workflow to the next level, you can start your free 30-day trial of Astropad Studio today. Just visit astropad.com to get started. Again, that URL is astropad.com to get started with a 30-day free trial of Astropad Studio. Our thanks to Astropad Studio for their support of Dialogue.
All right, so I have to ask this question. Is there an iOS version coming in the future sometime, maybe? And why is the app desktop only so far? And sort of what are your considerations for in regards to, I guess, the iPad Pro as a professional computer, and maybe having some time down the road an iPad version of Highland?
We've had an internal version of Highland that works on an iPad and for years, and it's not that challenging to do the basic things that Highland needs to do on the iPad. The challenge has largely been about files, and so the best way to handle the files that are created by the app and sort of what you do with the file and where that file should live. You're a good person to talk with because you obviously have a very iOS-centered workflow, but that's not the experience of sort of most screenwriters. We're very used to, here's this file, I'm opening this file, where is this file? That has been the real challenge for us. And so the reason why we focused on getting the desktop version the best it can be is with our limited resources, we had to sort of focus on what is the Mac OS version that works best. The second issue we've really encountered, and this is talking with other folks who've done the iOS versions of their apps, is they're not making any money. That they're having a hard time charging enough for the iOS version for it to actually be a sustainable business. And that's an unfortunate part of where we're at right now. So right now, Highland 2 is a free download. It's an in-app purchase to get all the pro features. It's conceivable that we could do the same thing for iOS or somehow tie those things together, but that hasn't been the priority up to this point.
I could see you potentially also doing some kind of subscription. I mean, subscriptions tend to work pretty well for professional apps these days. And I mean, if screenwriters are using this and making their living, I mean, I suppose a subscription is a possibility. Have you ever considered that?
We have considered it. So we surveyed all of our users to see how they felt about it. This was, a year and a half ago. And people were really, really opposed to subscriptions. Maybe that's a kind of thing that people will get over. There's subscription apps I use that I love, and so I have no problem with subscriptions in theory. But the screenwriters who are trying to wean off a final draft, they're used to buying an app and using it for 5 years, and so getting them to switch over to a subscription model has been a challenge.
Yeah, subscriptions are difficult, I think, especially if you're an established app and you're switching models. We've seen a lot of developers struggle with that, where there's a lot of unhappy customers, at least in the short term, although I think a lot of them have done okay in kind of the longer term, but it is a very painful transition, I think.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with BB Edit. So BB Edit, of course, now has a subscription version of it. And I mean, there's no more, old school app than BB Edit. So we'll see how people feel about it.
Could you tell us a little bit about Highland 2.5 and the new things that you've added to the app? Because there's some really interesting things in here.
Again, most of the things that we end up sort of building into the app are things that people are asking for, or more likely things that I really needed. And so I really needed starred revisions, which is where going from this draft to the next draft, I need to be able to show what has changed. And so finding the right way to do that within Highland was a challenge, but we were able to do it. It necessitated making some under the hood changes so that we are, we're always true to our plain text roots, so that what you see on screen in plain text is what's really informing the document. But something like this is a revision is a really difficult thing to do in just plain text, because, we've all seen the versions where you try to put brackets around things to indicate what's changed. It's really difficult to read. It's really awkward. Revisions are kind of meta information. And so we needed to find a way to store that meta information while still keeping the plain text plain. So behind the scenes now, Highland uses a sort of a package format that lets us keep track of what has actually changed revision by revision, so we can actually go through and mark things properly. So if I turn on revision mode and I type a few new lines of dialogue, they'll show up in color and there'll be stars at the margins, and it helps you see like what is new and what is different. So revision mode is by far the biggest change. We've always had themes where you can change the colors of the app and sort of customize them, pick what you like. We wanted people to have full customization capabilities. We ended up building a web-based chooser that lets you sort of put together your theme, and then you can import that into Highland or share it with other people. So you can build a custom theme and share it with your friends, which is just fun to do. There's a lot of changes under the hood and sort of cases where we had different ways of handling markdown documents and found documents, and we've pretty much erased the distinctions between them. So you can now have title pages in markdown documents. You can put links in found documents. We didn't want there to be any sort of cognitive weight about thinking, okay, is this a thing I could do in this kind of document or only the other kind of document? Basically, you can now do everything in both kind of documents. So down to centering and term lists and some esoteric things that are screenwriting things, but you might need to sometimes do in Markdown. It's all one thing. So even our cheat sheets, which are the sort of quick guides to how to do stuff, they merge together too. So it's one way that everything works together.
Could you tell me a little bit about word analysis that you've got in Highland 2.5? Because I know that Federico and I both use iWriter a fair amount, and there's like almost a parts of speech highlighting feature of that app. But I know that the word analysis going on in Highland is a little different than that. What exactly is happening there?
Word analysis was a feature that I'd asked Nima to try, and it was just kind of an experiment. And I would say it's still a little bit experimental, but it's been useful for me to figure out, it's going through the whole document and taking a look at, okay, what are all the words? And I'd actually built an experiment myself just using a Python script to sort of build a dictionary of like, these are all the words in this file and how often are these words being used. So you can rank them based on what you're using, but then compare like what words are actually not in a normal dictionary. Like what words are you making up? And so it's a kind of a spell checker, but it's also, are you being consistent, or are you changing a character's name in two different places? Are there little small things? And it's highlighting what those situations could be. For a screenwriter, another thing you often run into is, are you using the right words for the country that this story is supposed to be set in? So there are differences between US English and British English. And it will show you all the words that you're using that actually have two different forms. And so if you are using the wrong word for the situation, you can see that and go through and quickly check it. So it's a fun little gizmo, but that actually ends up being useful for certain circumstances.
That's really interesting. So I know Federico asked you about Highland for iOS, but that doesn't exist, but you do have some iOS apps. And I want to ask you about Weekend Read. Could you explain what that app does?
Sure. So as a screenwriter, you're often being sent PDFs to read, or there's a screenplay that you need to read, and it's only as a PDF. And you can read it on your phone if you're willing to pinch and squint a lot, basically to try to, because you're trying to blow up that page so you can read it properly. We already had the ability to melt PDFs in Highland. So I went to Nima and said, like, could we do this on iOS? He's like, absolutely. Like, the phone is totally fast enough. So it's doing the same thing that Highland does, where it melts down the PDF, but it's showing you on your screen in a format that's like much easier to read. And so it's taking what would be tiny little type and blowing it up to whatever size you need. It can read it aloud to you. It can, really makes those screenplays much more accessible than they used to be. Then once we had this ability to read those PDFs, we looked for where are a bunch of screenplay PDFs we can show folks? And every year, as award season comes around, all those Oscar-nominated movies put all their screenplays online. And so we link out to all those things. So if you want to read the screenplay for pretty much any big movie that came out in the last 5 years, we have them in our library, and we're linking directly to the studios where they're hosting those PDFs.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by HabitMinder. Forming new habits is tough. Get help with HabitMinder, the ultimate habit tracker and reminder app for iOS. HabitMinder has a beautiful clutter-free design that makes it easy to use and a pleasure to open. The app has a ton of predefined habits built right in. In fact, there are 50 to get you started. And if that's not enough, you can create your own custom habits too. HabitMinder uses a special habit session screen to help you complete your habits and includes custom reminders and notification frequencies to tune the app to just the way you like. Once you've started forming a new habit, you'll want to check out HabitMinder's statistics too to see your progress and your streaks. It's a great way to stay motivated. Of course, many of the habits you track with HabitMinder also integrate with Apple's own health app. There's a great dark mode too. To learn more about HabitMinder, go right now to habitminder.com. Again, that URL is habitminder.com to learn more. Change your habits and change your life with HabitMinder, your healthy habit reminder and tracker. Our thanks to HabitMinder for their support of Dialogue.
It's another project that you worked on, and it's not an app, but it's software. It's Courier Prime. So you designed the font. So you started with Courier, and you made it better. That's at least what the marketing says. How did this happen? How did the project begin, and how did you find the process of designing a font to be different from all your other projects?
So the designer is actually a guy named Alan Green, and so I commissioned it, but I didn't do the tweaking of individual letter forms. But here's the genesis behind it is, from when I first started working as a screenwriter, I was really frustrated by couriers and that they're not consistent from printer to printer, from system to system. Sometimes they're way too thin. So I wanted a better looking courier, especially for screenplay pages, because there's not a lot of text on most screenplay pages, and so you want your courier to be just a little bit darker than it would otherwise be. So Alan Green is a person who listens to my podcast, Script Notes, and wrote in and said, I'm also a font designer. I bet I could make this font for you. So we talked about sort of what the brief is, like what were the design goals, and just iterated again and again and again, and looking at sort of what weights of courier would look best. And we'd have sample pages and blind testing and like A, B's, and C's, and people would have to, strangers would look through and tell us what looked best to them. The other crucial thing I wanted was a courier where there were true italics and it wasn't just slanted letters. And so true italics look a little bit more like cursive, and you end up using italics quite a bit in screenwriting to just, for emphasis, for lyrics, for other things where you want to set stuff aside. And so with a better italics, you really could create a new feel on the page. And this wasn't starting from scratch. There used to be a true italics for old typewriters. It's just they'd kind of gone away, and no one had brought them to computer typefaces.
And just to clarify, but a screenplay has to be formatted with Courier as a font? Is it just a standard of the industry?
It's a convention. And so you could, there's nothing really magical about Courier, but it's so much the convention that any other font you tried to use, people would, it would be the first thing people would notice, and they would be a little bit freaked out by it. So, since we're kind of stuck with Courier, at least let's make it a better looking Courier, as one that, is sort of happy and easy on your eyes.
Yeah, I find the entire process to be extremely fascinating of a writer commissioning his own font, sort of like a pilot commissioning his own airplane. I think it's awesome, honestly.
Thank you. So I wanted the world to have it. So it's as free and open a license as exists in the world. So even, not only can you install it on your machine, you can take the files and build your own version. So there's now Cyrillic versions. There's other versions for different things. We created a sans serif version with the same metrics. And so Highland actually uses the sans serif version as the main editing font in the app. So that's Highland Sans. It's also Courier Prime Sans. There's a coding version that slashes the zeros and does a few other tweaks to make it better for coding. We just wanted there to be a typeface that people were happy to use when they needed a good monospace font.
There's something that I forgot to ask you about Highland. Are you aware of other users that are using Highland but not for screenplays? I think you mentioned that you wrote the novels using Highland.
Yeah, there are more and more novelists I'm talking about who are using it for longer things. I think some novelists have gravitated towards Scrivener, which is a really complicated app, but has features that some people really love. Many are still using Microsoft Word, and I feel just horrible for them. So we're trying to broaden a perspective beyond just screenwriters. So people, I use it for literally everything I write. I don't open up any other apps for writing stuff. And I do find more and more people who are starting with it as a screenwriting app and just finding, oh, you know what, I can actually use this for everything.
John, I wanted to ask you a little bit about podcasting, and it's a little afield from our topic, which is writing, but in listening both to Script Notes and Launch, Launch struck me as a much more highly produced show than Script Notes, and I want to, I guess, explore with you a little bit the difference between the two, and whether Launch was actually a scripted show that you wrote out, and how the two differ.
Yeah, so Script Notes is just like the show we're doing right now, where it's people talking over Skype, and sometimes we're in the room together, but mostly it's people talking over Skype. It's just a conversation. For the Launch podcast, it was a highly produced thing with a full script, and that was really hard to adjust to, because we tried sample episodes where it was just kind of an outline and it was like sort of free talking, and it just did not work. And so I ended up having to write every episode, which took days to write the episodes. I'd write it in Highland, paste it into a shared Google Doc where we could all edit it and sort of come together on stuff, and then record it and have to do multiple takes of recordings. I had a hard time finding my voice for that, because it's not quite my speaking voice. It's a little bit more optimized. I had to anticipate when there would be music, when I would be cutting in interview stuff. It was a lot. I naively thought that I recorded all these interviews along the way, I'll just cut them in. It's just a completely different world.
Yeah, I can imagine. And having edited this show, having recorded all those interviews, getting the sound levels and everything to sound natural and not jarring between transitions I'm sure it was not easy at all.
Yeah, so I wasn't doing the individual editing on that, but and even the job titles sort of shifted, because we had 3 producers who were helping put stuff together, and sometimes they were literally cutting stuff, but we also had engineers who were doing the sound mixing. We had, Matthew Chalelli, who does music for us, had to score sections. It was a really different process, and I loved it. But the reason why there aren't more episodes of Launch is that there just isn't time.
Yeah, that to me, that's a whole different world. That's very much more like, I guess, maybe the NPR style Serial and all those kind of podcasts, I suppose, right?
Definitely. And, I have a real appreciation for how hard it is to make those. The inspiration behind it was Startup, which is Alex Bloomberg's podcast about starting his podcasting company. And having now done a show like that, wow, that's really hard.
That's pretty amazing. So I want to ask you a little bit about what you've got planned for the future. Where are things going from here? You've just got Highland 2.5 out, and what are you working on today?
So today we are working on launch stuff for Highland 2.5. So I'm checking my Slack, and Alejandro, who's our marketing person, needs me to get back to him about the invitation to our launch event. We have billboards that are going up around Los Angeles, which is crazy, figuring out all that stuff. And then there's other stuff on sort of our weekly whiteboard. We have a meeting where we sit down and like talk about all the stuff we're working on. And really, we can kind of focus on one or two things at a time. So it's getting back to the other stuff. We're very excited about WWDC, which is coming up as we're recording this, and looking at sort of what changes in Weekend Read based on what happens there. If there are big Mac OS changes, obviously Highland would need to incorporate this as well. So it's looking for where we head next.
It's very interesting to me that you have billboards for an app because that's not something you see every day, but I guess you've got the concentration of writers right there in the Los Angeles area. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, this was a wild experiment, so I'm not sure it was the best use of time and money, but not I would say most screenwriters, but a huge proportion of screenwriters are here in Los Angeles and really within a very small section of Los Angeles. So we've bought some billboards here and we'll see how that does.
Yeah, that's awesome. Maybe by the time this episode is out, we should have some pictures of those billboards in the show notes for the podcast, John.
I will send you some right now.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. John, I want to thank you for joining us for dialogue today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Where can people find you online if they want to follow your work?
So my website is johnaugust.com. On Twitter, I'm at John August. Instagram, I'm also at John August. Script Notes is the best place to sort of hear me every week. That's the podcast I do with Craig Mazin. So just Script Notes wherever you listen to podcasts.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I want to thank our two sponsors again for this episode. That's Astropad and HabitMinder. And you can find me and Federico. We're over on macstories.net and on Twitter and Instagram. He and I are both have the same username. Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.